Black female explains the 13th Amendment.
When we talk about June 19th, it was a bill that originally passed on January the 31st, 1865. Then it was ratified on December the 6th of 1865. And it was the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery. Hold on one second. The official date was June the 19th, 1865. Now, you look at the dates. They had to wait several months, almost close to a year, to pretty much have to tell Texas, kid you not, that there's no more enslavement. Okay? So that's how the honor of June 19th had came about. But here's the thing. After slavery, what was the confliction and the misery that blacks were still going into? First of all, there was no jobs. There was no safety and security, which is a shelter. The men somehow ended up being segregated from the women. The children and the mothers sometimes the mothers were separated again from their children. Did you know they was kidnapping children and were trying to force the children to do slave labor because they claimed in the South that they had to compensate their last crops but here's the thing. When the slaves were abolished from slavery and they had this law, they did not receive their 40 acres and a mule. Their 40 acres and a mule was taken away from them by the help of the vice president who took the placement of Abraham Lincoln. But here it goes. They started coming out with their own laws. And this is where the Jim Crow laws came about. First, they started rallying an organization called the Ku Klux Klan. Now, the head member had started originally in Alabama, but he escalated and made the foundation to be Tennessee. This United States government gave them the charter. Then they started forming police officers, and it was not to regulate, it was to regulate us. Then they started building jails, and most of the time you saw black men in jails for crimes that they didn't do. In the Jim Crow laws, there was a Pacific segregation between the whites and the blacks. Okay? Now, when you look, blacks wasn't able enough to own a property. They wasn't able enough to own land. Even if it was handed down by the slave master or overseer, what 9/10 of the time could have been the father of that slave. But they will claim that they were not inherited to that because that was not the biological next of kin. So your father could turn around and rape your mom. You could have a child, and let's say you're born on that plantation and you're born as a slave. But at the end of the day, you turn around, you can't claim anything. That's how it was. I believe in those times from between slavery and after slavery, then they came with sharecropping. Sharecropping to me was like slavery because you barely, if you work the type of work that you work, if you didn't work, then you get kicked out from the plantation. When it's time for them to pay you, you pretty much, the tools and everything that you use, you have to end up using that, you pay off the consignment of that, which made no sense. So you left you through nothing. And if they tell you there was no compensation for sick time, holiday time, or none of that, you had to go out there and work. But guess what? This good old-fashioned America, they turned around and compensated the plantation owners and claimed it was through their insurance. And every time they had lost a slave, or they got compensation for the loss of their slave. But the slaves did not receive any money, no assessments, no land, nothing of that sort. It's pretty much how it is now. Because if you look at the society we live in, there's no protection. They took away affirmative action. They're probably going to start taking the women's rights away. Okay? Then, moreover, they even trying to take away our education by saying that organizations cannot do fundings for us because of our skin color, because they have to do something called the diversity of everybody. Meanwhile, the other diversity of everybody pretty much have their own organization, their own distribution, and they pretty much can support their own people, but we can't support our own. And they put a wedge between our society. So I say to ourselves, like, was it the best thing for us to be slaves or not being slaves? I mean, I know that question is a rhetorical question. Nobody should be a slave. But when you look in institutions that you're looking in, do you see any of our people getting promotion? And when we did get promotion, this is before the affirmative action, we was able enough to escalate and do better. Now, because they took those things away from us, now we went back to square one again. And people don't realize what's going on. All our leaders who basically was teaching us and giving us the prophecy, which we cared not to listen to, they died. They assassinate our leaders. They assassinate our prophets, whether it was singing, poetry, flowetry, whether it was an educator, whether it was a doctor or lawyer. But meanwhile, their people are they still have the white supremacy. They have multiple white supremacies in all different type of diaspora. And you don't see them getting assassinated. You don't see them going to jail. You don't see them, they could do whatever they want. They own businesses, corporations, and everything. And nobody touches their money. Okay? But with us, they watch every nook and cranny what we do. We didn't get a hate crime. Look how many times we turn around, we keep on seeing on newspapers of young black men being unalived by police officers or the hands of someone that's racist. But meanwhile, listen to this. We don't get a hate crime bill. Okay? And we're the number one is being targeted in this country. Look, from the time when the young boy went to Buffalo, New York, and started shooting those innocent black people, there should have been a hate crime ban. The time when that young man rang the doorbell accidentally and went to the wrong house and got shot, there should have been a hate crime. The time when that young man got hanged after he was trying to stroll and go for a jog, and these three men took it upon themselves to hang him to death, there should have been a hate crime. There should have been a hate crime when we saw the police officer putting the knee down on a guy's neck and the guy saying, "I can't breathe," and he died. This should have been a hate crime. This should have been a hate crime when a gentleman was coming from a strip club, from his bachelor party, and he got shot nearly 18 random bullets. And they reloaded the bullets again by 3 cops that claimed that they were undercover, but they were under the influence of alcohol. This should have been a hate crime when a young man was strolling in the neighborhood and he was getting a Starburst and he had a hoodie over his head. This should have been a hate crime. There should have been multiple hate crimes there should have been a hate crime when a young lady was in the bedroom with her husband or her boyfriend and they came in there and started shooting down the place. Come to find out, they wanted to get the people them out of there because they wanted to gentrify the neighborhood. There should have been a hate crime when the young man was sleeping in his bed and these cops came out of nowhere and started shooting him for no reason at all. There should have been a hate crime when the guy was in his car trying to load packages and these 2 men started shooting up and shoot up. He lost his job and he also lost his status. He's probably right now unemployed. There should have been multiple hate crimes when you had a former president that basically was starting and stirring the pot about racist stuff. Now he's coming around to black people and shaking their hands and being their friends. There should have been a hate crime when that same former police president turned around and told these 6 young men that they're guilty and they already started the execution right before he could have even went to court, and they ended up going to jail for a crime that they didn't do. There should have been multiple hate crimes when these young men, known as the Scotch Boys, went to jail because 2 women claimed that they had raped them, and come to find out they never touched them, and they tortured them to death. Only 1 survivor. There should have been a hate crime when those ladies came to the Supreme Court and telling the situation of what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma versus with Osage, and they got reparations, but they didn't get reparation. There should have been multiple situations that blacks went through from years to years to decades to centuries, and then they give us is this holiday. No national, and they all dancing up and down, Jubilee, what a joyful noise unto the Lord. You know what? Take it and shove it up your behind. Not to our ancestors, not to June 19th. First of all, you had no choice but to do abolished because the blacks were getting tired and they were starting to burn down the place. Okay, because they saw what was happening in the Caribbean and they wanted to be free.